Okay, well, first off, congratulations to Esteban Ocon. Been a fan for a long time, since watched him in GP3. Monza, I think, was the first time really took note of him. And I was always bemoaning his sitting around in the garage that year. He had to sit it out, and why Formula One would be wasting a talent like that. But he found his home at Alpine, and here he is winning a Grand Prix. An absolutely superb drive from Esteban. Didn't actually make a single mistake. A little bit cautious coming into the pit lane, as he would be in that position for his race-defining tyre stop. But a very, very good outlap as prescribed by, I think it was Mark Slade on the radio. And if it was Mark, congratulations to you too. You've won a lot of races over the years at McLaren, and now obviously at Renault and at Alpine, and you deserve this one. Really, really good. For me, it was a little bit like Pierre Gasly's win at Monza, because I think, just as Gasly, I think, beat the better car there, he beat Carlos Sainz in the McLaren. I think on this occasion, I was surprised. I don't know how you guys felt, but I was surprised that Sebastian Vettel and Aston didn't win that race. I think the Aston was a slightly better car, all-round package, Mercedes engine as well, of course, not in any way to detract from the achievement of Alpine, but looking at that, you'd think, wow, Sebastian's going to do this. He said afterwards, I couldn't push Esteban into a mistake. And I guess that's what it came down to. Although if he'd been a little bit closer throughout the race and in his mirrors a little bit more, not easy to do when you're following a car around Hungary, you lose a lot of downforce. But we saw how other drivers were doing that. Then he might have got that mistake out of Esteban, but he didn't. And it was just a great day for him. I can't help thinking, actually, of Romain Grosjean, who walked out of that team effectively to drive for Haas in the belief that doing well at Haas with Ferrari engines would get him into the factory Ferrari team. And he would, if he'd stayed, he would have been number one driver, French driver in a French team, but that's all gone now. So an excellent drive for Esteban. He out-qualified his teammate Fernando Alonso by 1/10 of a second yesterday, but he got a slightly better run out of that first corner, schmozzle, and that was effectively what gave him the track position. Fernando lost more time and was always on the back foot in the race. Although, of course, in the second half of the race, there was very little between them. And you got to feel a little bit for Fernando that if that team is going to win a Grand Prix this year, you would imagine it would be with Fernando's, particularly in Hungary on a circuit in which he's achieved so much in the past. But no, it went to his teammate. But great to see the two drivers sort of slowing down and Fernando giving him the old thumbs up on the slowdown lap. As much as that would have been hurting Fernando, I think he behaved really well. How he actually drove when he was alongside Lewis, that's another matter. We'll get onto that in a little bit as well. So that's the first order of business, to congratulate Esteban on that win. And it's, he's always been a talent. I remember doing that photo shoot with him out in after Abu Dhabi in the desert, and he was on his bicycle. Really, really good cyclist, actually, and we did a lot of great stuff with him then. And that was long after I'd become a fan. And I think, part of his pedigree actually is the Force India team and the guys he grew up with there, Tom McCulloch and the boys. So it was quite interesting, I think, that it was the old Force India team, in effect, that he outdrove and beat today in Hungary. So let's look at the order of business after that. Kind of difficult to get it all right. I guess it all started on the grid with light rain falling. And at that moment, it was very even, really, because Max Verstappen would have been thinking, okay, I didn't have a great qualifying. I'm on the second row, but this rain, we're all going to be starting on intermediate. So that's kind of evened it out for me in terms of how this race is going to go. And I'm really good in the wet, obviously. That's what Max would have been thinking. And I think Lewis would have been thinking, I love the wet. And if Max was always going to get an advantage into the first corner on the soft tyres, that's gone away now. We're all on intermediate, so all bets are off, and let's have a good motor race. So I think the rain was a good equaliser at the start, but then we saw what happened. And it was all triggered by Valtteri Bottas making yet another terrible start. I mean, what is going on with this guy? He made a terrible start, and then as a result of that, he tries to make up for it by braking ridiculously late on this greasy track, on cold intermediates, into turn one, and succeeded in taking about Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, and Lando Norris. But also, very, very nearly took out his teammate Lewis Hamilton. And at the end of it, when he got out of the car, I thought it was quite interesting that his message was, that's it. It was almost as if, I've had enough. And, Valtteri, things are going from bad to worse for you at the moment. I thought the writing was on the wall when you spun in the pit lane in Austria, and said as much in the video that day. You've got to be thinking now that Mercedes are saying, this cannot continue. Because imagine if he'd taken Lewis out of that race as well. After the long delay to make all the repairs to the track, and there was another incident as well when Lance Stroll, you could argue that the field was all bunched up because of that accident, and Lance Stroll was kind of a victim of that because he arrived too quickly, obviously couldn't stop, and T-boned Charles Leclerc and got him out of the race as well. That would have been their argument. I think the stewards made the right decision, though, to say that, like Bottas, he was there, he had time to stop, he was going too quickly, and you're hitting people from behind. 5-place grid penalty at the next race and points, of course. So I think that was a just decision. For Lance, that was a big opportunity lost. And I can imagine from where he was on the grid, he was thinking semi-wet, intermediates. I've always been good in the wet. I've got to make up some ground in the first corner. Probably wasn't watching too much about what was going on, just trying to brake really late, like Valtteri. And there was poor Charles Leclerc up on the curb on the inside, trying to keep out of the way, which he'd basically done. He got T-boned then by Lance. So that was it for Ferrari. So you're in the pit lane now, and Max has got a lot of damage to the right-hand side of the car. And I was surprised. I was surprised by two things. And I suppose the answer is because they just couldn't do it. But I don't understand why, and I'll try and get the answer during the next few days, why Red Bull couldn't change the floor and basically then put all the new barge boards and everything that they needed onto Max's car, instead of which they kind of taped everything up, and it definitely wasn't a great race car in which he went back into the Grand Prix. There seemed to be enough time to do that. It doesn't take that much time to change the floor, but I'm sure there'll be an explanation for that as we go. Or maybe something was broken. Maybe they didn't have a spare floor. Maybe it was as simple as that. That was one. Two, when Max is in the position he's in at the back there, and he is going back into the race, and it's going to be very, very lucky even for him to score a point, why not in that situation take the gamble and put him on slicks at the start? Had they done that, he might have, I don't think he would have won it because the car was too badly damaged, but he might have been top 3 in the Grand Prix. And I found that, for Red Bull, who normally think very quickly on their feet, I thought that was a rather strange decision. And it was strange today to see everybody basically doing the same thing, because Lewis was on the grid, the initial grid, saying, I think we should be on slicks. It's going to be very, very even. And if you've got a driver like Lewis Hamilton with his talent saying that, as I've always said, if it's a 50-50 choice and you've got a quick, very good field driver in your car, go for slicks. There's never any option in my view. But these days it seems to be what everybody else does, we must do the same. And that's what kind of happened obviously at the end of the formation lap for the second start, with George Russell calling it completely. Everybody's going to come in for medium tyres, and everybody came in for slicks, except of course the race leader Lewis Hamilton, who went round to do his standing start. Now this begs the question of what would have happened if Lewis had come in as well. What would have happened to the standing start procedure? There's been no precedent for this at all, and I don't think the rules actually cover a situation where there are no cars on the grid and the start procedure still taking place. But I think that's what would have happened. They would have gone through a red light sequence. Lewis would have been in the pit lane as well. But the big issue would have been when they would have put the green light on for the pit lane. Because, when does the race effectively start at that point? That was, I think, that is something that everyone will be talking about now and looking at, because there wouldn't have been anything wrong for Lewis to have come in. And I think you could say, well, maybe Mercedes were thinking we have to take the start. Lewis is on the pole. It's a standing start. There's no other option. Obviously, in Lewis's mind, that's what was happening. And he said afterwards, my last. He obviously didn't know that he was the only guy on the grid. Why would he? I mean, he's just looking at the start. He's looking at all the stuff. He's probably listening to the radio. He's looking at the start gantry, temperatures, everything else. It probably never occurred to him to even look and think, wow, there's nobody behind me. I think the other point about Mercedes not bringing Lewis in, and this is probably more the case, was that because they're number one in the pit lane, had they brought Lewis in, he would have then come out and faced 4 cars all coming in front of him, and it would have been a really difficult exit, and that probably coloured Mercedes' decision to make him start on the intermediates and then bring him in after that one lap. But bringing him in after one lap, of course, meant that he was then going to be last in the race, and he drove through the field to finish 3rd. So I think that's the next order of business, to say fabulous drive by Lewis Hamilton, coloured by some incredible passes, some incredible wheel-to-wheel racing. And then we'll get to this turn 4, which is the lovely, very quick left-hander. They go in the dry, it's from 7th down to 6th. It's a really quick corner. And Lewis was always quicker than everybody who was around him through that left-hander. And he got a few people like Yuki Tsunoda on the outside going in there. But when you come up against guys like Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz, it's a different story, of course. And Lewis probably could have won this race, back end of the race, had he not lost so much time behind. I say lost. Had he not spent so much time having to fight Fernando Alonso for fourth place. And Fernando was tough. He was really tough to overtake there. And I don't think Lewis did himself any favours in view of everything that's happened post-Silverstone by saying it's really dangerous to change direction at high speed. You know, calm it, Lewis, because a lot of people out there are still talking about cops at Silverstone and what happened there at high speed. So yeah, that wasn't a particularly clever radio message, but I love some of Lewis's other radio messages, all of which summed up Lewis being completely in the zone. At one point, wondering if it was 46 laps to go or whether they'd done 46 laps. I mean, you'd imagine a driver in a 70-lap race would know that, kind of, but he didn't. And I thought that was very telling and very typical Lewis, not knowing exactly what position he was in, how many cars he had to pass. And then by contrast, there was that rather crass radio message from Toto saying, you can win this, Lewis. And looking at the mathematics, of course he could win it. The amount of time he was gaining on a new set of mediums at the end because he made 2 stops relative to the guys in front. But he had to pass them all. You know, he had to pass Alonso and Carlos Sainz. So that's where all that time was going to go. And it was never going to happen, of course, passing guys like that. So Lewis, given all of that, and given how difficult it is to overtake, and some of the passes he made, and the mistakes he pushed the drivers in front into making, Fernando particularly eventually just locked up and ran wide at turn 1, and it was an easy pass for Lewis. You know, Sebastian Vettel, take note, because that was a racer's drive. The other point he's got to make, of course, is when Fernando saw Lewis in his mirrors, you have to wonder whether or not there was a flashback to Hungary and everything that happened in the McLaren team between Fernando and Lewis, and whether it was, you're never going to pass me, you're never going to pass me. I don't know. Fernando, you know, he's mellowed a lot, and I think he was one of the first people recently to congratulate Lewis on a championship win last year, I think. So I don't think there was any of that, and I'm just being a bit mischievous there. Anyway, moving on. So Lewis drove really well. Second place, I think Sebastian underdrove. I think that car could have won that Grand Prix and probably would have won that Grand Prix if you'd had a Max Verstappen or a Lewis Hamilton in it. And going back to the lead again, Esteban Ocon, so happy for you, mate. That's it, those 3. Now, let's look at Carlos Sainz. Now, when Lewis dropped to the back of the field, obviously at that second restart, and the race was now being led by Esteban Ocon, Sebastian Vettel, with Nicholas Latifi doing a really good job in the Williams in P3. I mean, obviously he'd inherited space, but he was very near George in qualifying at this Grand Prix. They qualified within a tenth of one another, and at one point on Friday he was top 10 as well. I mean, he's driven well all weekend, and there he was in P3 doing a really good job. And Yuki Tsunoda behind him, yeah, that was great too after the difficult crash he had and various other bits and bobs, and there he was going really well too. And then Carlos Sainz, and you thought, Carlos Sainz, Ferrari, for sure he's going to win this Grand Prix. There's no way in the world Carlos Sainz isn't going to win the Hungarian Grand Prix today. And when the pit stop window loomed for Carlos, it was almost as if the engineers were a bit afraid to say to him, what is going on? It was like, Carlos, maybe you should come in for tyres. And he said, no, I have pace in the car, And it was like, yeah, well, where is this pace? And immediately he went a 1.5 lap quicker. Where had he been? What had he been doing? And then it fell away again. And then he came in for tyres. And then he basically settled for what he thought was third place. There was a moment when Lewis was behind him on hard tyres that were starting to wear quite badly. And Carlos got on the radio to say, I have the feeling that Lewis is going to box soon. And the radio came back, the engineers came back and said, yeah, if you just stay where you are, I'm sure you can finish third. Instead of saying, you know, get it going, you could win this Grand Prix. You're in a Ferrari, get out there and win the Grand Prix. I found that absolutely amazing, that he was quite happy to settle for third place and thought that even if Lewis did stop for new tyres, that third place was in the bag. Yeah, right, as we saw. And a disappointing day too for McLaren, obviously with Lando out of it, and Daniel got some sort of collateral damage in the whole Lance Stroll thing as well, so he was nowhere all day as well. So both McLarens are out and both Williams in the points. So congratulations congratulations to them too. Nicholas Latifi and George Russell finishing 8th and 9th in the Williams-Mercedes. Excellent day for them. Took advantage of everything that was going on around them and made the most of it. Mick Schumacher was quite spectacular in defence. Took a lot of drivers, Max, Lewis, a lot of drivers time to get past him, and he was never an easy target at all. So the racer coming out of Mick, ready for the first time we've seen that, even though it was in defence rather than attack, and good to see that he finished the race in 13th place. Max finished 10th, got 1 point for that. Fastest lap actually went to Pierre Gasly on a new set of tyres towards the end. But that means with Lewis finishing 3rd, Max 10th, that means that Lewis, going into the August break now, is in the lead, the points lead of the World Championship. That doesn't mean anything in terms of the number of races we have coming. It's still a long, long way to go. But it does mean something in terms of momentum, and it means something in terms of taking it into the August break and where are we now. As I said yesterday, Red Bull, I suspect, will be looking at how they need to adapt their car, do a better job adapting their car to the new stiffer rear Pirellis, and they'll be thinking, why do the Pirellis seem to work, these new stiffer rear Pirellis seem to work so much better on the Mercedes and the Ferrari, and to some extent the Aston Martin. And I guess you've got to say now the Alpine as well. And Formula One in general can go into the August break thinking, wow, that was the most incredible race, certainly the most incredible start to a Grand Prix we've had since, 2005 Indianapolis, 2007 European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. It would have been nice. It would have been, at one point, right at the beginning there, it would have been cool if George Russell had actually led the Hungarian Grand Prix, but that didn't happen. But nonetheless, we had an amazing winner in Esteban Ocon in the Alpine. So congratulations yet again to him and to the Alpine team, a lot of whom have been around since the old Benetton days. And of course, it was the Benetton days that took Fernando Alonso to his first Grand Prix victory in Hungary. So this circuit means a lot to some of those guys behind the computers in the garage and on the pit wall. Best wishes to everybody for the August break. Many thanks to Jetcraft yet again for their support of this channel, and thanks to you, the viewer, for watching. See you again soon.